One of the greatest swords in all of video games, and probably one of the most recognizable weapons in all of fantasy, is the Master Sword. The Master Sword has been around for, well, ever since Link to the Past. This is the Blade of Evil's Bane, a magical weapon designed to pretty much destroy anything evil, and it's been used countless times to stop both Ganon and Ganondorf from achieving their goals. This is a beautiful weapon, a beautiful blade, and overall is just a really awesome sword. It's probably one of my favorite swords ever. Now, the Master Sword in and of itself doesn't really have that many secrets to its name. We already know how it was made, we already know why it was made, and we already know the spirit that resides in it being Feet. However, what if I were to tell you that there is a massive mystery that no one has ever tackled? A mystery hiding in Ocarina of Time, one of the greatest games ever, yet almost nobody has ever truly noticed it. That being the mystery symbol on the Master Sword. Okay, before we jump into this, I'm sure a lot of you are probably wondering what exactly I'm talking about. Well, let me explain. Ocarina of Time, everybody knows it, everybody has at least played it or seen it at least one time in their life. It is probably one of the most influential games that the franchise ever had, and it's considered one of the greatest. And one thing that made it so memorable was the introduction to the Master Sword that we all know and love today. This game established that purple and gold aesthetic to the Master Sword, which became prominent throughout the years. And in this game, we end up pulling the Master Sword and putting the Master Sword back several times over to travel through time by 7 years. However, when pulling the sword out as a child, there's something very interesting. The gem on the Master Sword actually ends up disappearing, and an odd golden emblem appears as Link travels forward through time. This symbol has ended up being extremely overlooked for, well, years. Next to no one has ever talked about it, and if you try and do any research online, you'll come to, well, what many already assume is the main reason for this, just a graphical glitch. Possibly just being an oddity of the actual crystal texture itself when the sword is pulled with all the effects happening around it. Now, this is not the only instance of this sword having this odd symbol, as in-game, while you play, if you whip out your sword and take a closer look at it, well, there it is. It's right there, the same odd symbol. Now, I wanted to see if the symbol had more of a past to it. Maybe it was only for this version, or maybe it was farther back. Or maybe this is just an odd graphical glitch specifically with the Master Sword, and the texture isn't actually normally supposed to look like that, since the 3DS version's Master Sword stays consistent all throughout the game. Now, yeah, I know I'm comparing apples to oranges, you know, Ocarina of Time's N64 to the 3DS version, which the 3DS is a very big power difference, but still, I don't see why it would have been that difficult to create a Master Sword model that was low poly, that had a flush gold diamond instead of this odd symbol. So I wanted to dive deeper into this topic and see if this was consistent all through the past. I decided to delve into the old beta of Zelda Ocarina of Time, originally known as Zelda 64. During my research looking through all these old screenshots and videos, I wasn't actually able to find anything. I didn't see anything associated with the Master Sword, and anything with the Master Sword didn't actually show a symbol because how grainy most of the photos were. That was until I ran across one single image. This screenshot actually shows Link in a very late game state, specifically around the time of the Space 97 Expo. Now, most people, when viewing this screenshot, mainly focus on the fact that the medallions are equipable. But what's even more interesting is that if you take a look at the Master Sword, it actually shows the same golden symbol that was on the Master Sword in the final version via that strange texture glitch. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that this might just be a glitch that's been persistent all the way back during the Space Expo, maybe even before that. Well, that could make sense and be a possibility if it wasn't for the fact that we already know that there's an actual texture file dedicated to this strange symbol. A user on the now defunct Twitter, known as X, posted about this very symbol, wondering what it was. However, what he found was that this actual symbol is a texture file in the Ocarina of Time game. So here's what's really interesting about this. What's actually happening is that there are technically two different texture maps for the Master Sword. The first one, which has the normal diamond on it, is mainly for when the actual Master Sword is stationary. However, when the Master Sword is in the player's hands, it becomes a movable object by the player. The texture is then swapped with this odd symbol. So, there we go. Seems like the mystery solved, right? Well, not quite. In fact, there's a little more to this mystery that still is quite interesting. You see, I got a little curious, and I wanted to look at the Bigoron sword, also known as the Giant's Knife, to see if maybe it had a similar symbol. The actual concept art for the Bigoron sword, as well as its higher textured version, both shows this really cool diamond-like symbol on it, not to mention it showing the Goron tribe symbol on its actual concept art. But when in-game, it doesn't have that same diamond crest or any kind of similar symbol to the actual main artwork. Instead, it has its own unique golden symbol, just like the Master Sword. That only then leaves the question, what is this symbol? Clearly, this is not an actual oddity with the textures itself. We've already established that. This is a legitimately created texture in the game. But why? What is it? What is it about? If you do any research into this topic, you'll find next to nothing, and most people just throw up their hands and say, it's probably something weird, I can't really tell what it is, can't really tell what it looks like. Well, I might have, just might have, a plausible explanation for what these symbols could mean. Now, please take everything I'm about to say with a literal sword's worth of salt, as a lot of what I have is mainly just conjecture. But out of the literal 0 reasons given for these symbols, I think this one is very well worth the look, and if anything, it at least gives somewhat of an explanation of what this could be. These symbols clearly mean something. Both of them are unique between the two, and they were clearly textured for these weapons. Well, my first thought is that these symbols might not actually be symbols, but rather letters. As we all know, Ocarina of Time and the Zelda franchise has its own very unique language, with multiple versions of Hylian, as well as different versions for Gerudo language, and so on and so forth. So I decided to focus my attention there on the original design for the Hylian language for Ocarina of Time, as at the time, this was the only Hylian form of language that we had. So that means we're not looking at any of the versions of Hylian from the later years, only the specific version in Ocarina of Time. Now, based on my research, I cannot say with 100% certainty that this is true, but based on what I researched, it seemed that Hylian needs to first be translated into Japanese, and then translated from Japanese to English. And that's where my idea started to formulate. What if these symbols on both the Biggoron sword and the Master Sword are actually Hylian symbols combined to create a unique symbol that is specific to the weapon? So I popped on Google Translate, set it for English to Japanese, and went straight to work. First, let's focus on Master Sword. The word in Japanese is pronounced Master Sodo. Now, if you try to translate Master Sodo straight into Hylian as one big word, it's not going to work. This theory completely goes bust. But it does work if you take the first 2 letters from Master and Sword, or Master and Sodo, being M-A and S-O. Funny enough, in Hylian language, it fits perfectly. Sodo starts with S-O, and there's a symbol dedicated to S-O, or the pronunciation of it. There's also a Hylian symbol for M-A, or Master. So we have both our 2 symbols, M-A and S-O, meaning that these 2 Hylian symbols would be the first symbols in the word Master Sword. Now, if my theory is right, combining these 2 letters together should create a unique symbol similar to the one on the Master Sword in-game, and sure enough, if you put them together and orient them just a bit, it creates a unique symbol very similar to the one we've seen in-game. Is it perfect? No. But it works far better than anything else you could try. So now let's apply the same rule to the Biggoron sword. I decided to base the wordage off of the giant's knife, as in the original beta, that is what it was originally called, was the giant's knife. Now, for the English word giant knife, in Japanese, it's pronounced as Kodain de Naifu. The first 2 letters in each of those pronunciations is KY and NA. Now, we do hit a bit of a problem here. When looking back in Hylian language, there is no abbreviation for KY. So it seems like this actually doesn't work. Except it still does, because in Hylian language, you can create combination of letters to create different pronunciations. And when you know it, there is a combination to create the same 3 letters, KYO in Japanese, in Hylian, being these 2 symbols here. Which means for our first symbol needed would be KI. So now we have our first letter for KI in giant. Now, thankfully, NA for Naifu is way easier, as Hylian language already has NA as its own symbol. So bam, we have 2 symbols that are already together. But when comparing to the actual Biggoron sword, it's already obvious that the symbols aren't quite there yet. In fact, the actual handle of the blade does obscure some of the symbol, so this is me kind of really going on a major limb here. But if you combine the symbols together and rotate them sideways, you get a very rough approximation of the symbol itself, meaning that it might, just might, be possible that this symbol in Hylian is the abbreviation form of the word giant's knife, meaning that each of these symbols are actually abbreviated symbols being specific to the respective swords, with this symbol specifically meaning Master Sword being imprinted onto the blade, and this symbol meaning Giant's Knife being imprinted onto its blade. Now, I know what you're already going to say. That seems like it's way too absurd to actually be the truth. Nintendo going out of their way to use the first letters of the Japanese abbreviation pronunciation of each of the actual words in English, and then use Hylian language to put those two letters together to create a unique symbol for each blade? I know, that sounds so absurd, but that's why I said to take all this with a sword's worth of salt, because a lot of this is literally batshit conjecture. But now, with all this information finally laid out, let's not waste any more time and put this narrative together. In Ocarina of Time, when pulling the Master Sword from its pedestal in the original version of the game, the sword's model changes from two separate objects. The first object is when the Master Sword is stationary, and the second object is the version of the sword that Link actually uses all throughout the game. There are already dedicated textures in the game with this exact symbol, meaning that this is not any kind of graphical glitch, but a legitimate swap of two separate models, from one that's meant to be a stationary object to another one that is meant to be a weapon that is used in-game. This symbol persisted for years, and it stayed this symbol all the way back during its original beta phase, and survived all the way up until now. The 3DS version does not have this symbol, meaning it is only unique to the original N64 version of this game. The Giant's Knife / the Bigoron Sword also has its own unique golden symbol, which is in a similar style to the one on the Master Sword. The symbols on each blade are unique to each one, being Hylian letters that are combined together to create a unique symbol to describe each blade, with the symbol on the Master Sword literally meaning the word Master Sword, and the symbol on the Giant's Knife meaning Giant's Knife. The reason for these symbols in game very well might have been because of the hilt design for each blade is somewhat similar. So having a unique texture for each of them might have been a way for the developers to tell the difference between the two blades. Specifically, the two versions of the blades that are used in-game by the player when in combat and in main game play. And though this explanation is definitely absurd and is not confirmed by any means, I feel like it's probably the best explanation for the true origins of these symbols, as crazy as that may sound. And that is the story of the mystery symbols on both the Master Sword and the Giant's Knife. I thought the symbol was really cool to look into. In fact, I already had an entire dedicated sheet to this entire bit of information that I got to use, which I really liked doing so. And overall, it's just a really cool take. This is something as a kid I've always wondered about. I always thought originally it was a Japanese symbol, but I never knew what to think of it. Any kind of research I did on this led me next to nowhere with no explanation. So it's really cool to finally see that these symbols were actually meant to be in-game as their own unique textures, and have at least some, maybe even if it's in my own headcanon, of an explanation of what these symbols could very well mean. And I really like the idea of these being modified Hylian letters combined together in order to create a specialized word for each blade as a bit of a descriptor and a way of telling them apart. I just think that's really cool. But what do you guys think? Do you think this makes complete sense? Did you ever notice that symbol? Or do you have your own idea or your own theory on what these symbols might mean, or the reason why they're their own separate models and creations in the game instead of just having a flat golden diamond, which we've already seen in game? I'm really curious what y'all think in the comments below. But until then, guys, that's where we're going to end this video off here. And thanks for delving in with me into this odd topic of the origin of this strange symbol on the Master Sword. I thought it was a blast. If you want to see more like this, hit the subscribe button down below, and I'll see you on the next one. Just signing out. Later.